There is an email that I still have in my files. Lori in the office sent it on March 12th, 2020, copying then President David Lears and me. Subject line is B'nai Mitzvah Parent Meeting this Sunday. And it reads, "Good morning, parents. Rabbi Mike would like to have a meeting this Sunday with the parents of the spring B'nai Mitzvah children. No decisions have been made. This meeting is to talk about getting everyone to feel safe and be on the same page." 2 days later, there is another email, and this time it's from me. "As much as we wanted to have our meeting in person tomorrow, David and I think it's wisest to meet by Zoom. We will send out instructions this evening." I probably don't have to tell you why we needed this meeting or why we ultimately moved it online. The day the first email went out, there were 405 reported cases of COVID-19 in the United States. The day the second email went out, there were 674 new cases. By the end of that month, March 2020, 30,000 new cases were reported in one day. By the end of the year, that number climbed to an unfathomable 300,000 cases. But in that moment, we were not addressing 300,000 people or even 405. We were addressing 6 families here at Beth Elohim, anticipating B'nai Mitzvah services for their sweet, wise, creative, and in general, delightful kids. B'nai Mitzvah are communal celebrations. Milestones not just for a kid and a family, but for a community. We welcome a young Jew into the adult community of Jews who chant and learn and we pray, live Torah. We do it in public with the community present. But how could we do that when being in community could be deadly? Ultimately, we decided to solve the problem in a way I don't think any other synagogue did. If our families couldn't safely come to the Torah, we would bring the Torah to them. And thus began a series of B'nai Mitzvah services celebrated via Zoom and held in congregants' backyards. Our first backyard bat mitzvah was of Nosara Maxwell, March 28th, 2020, in Greg and Maya's backyard in Acton. Since then, our Torahs have traveled to homes in Littleton and Groton, I've been so good about that. Littleton and Groton, Maynard and Bolton, Concord and Harvard and Stowe, and in between at backyards all across Acton. It was a schlep, of course, and not always easy, as the cantor can attest, and so many of you can as well. Our B'nai Mitzvah families learned a lot about the care and feeding of a Torah scroll. Everyone stands when the Torah is lifted. Never rested on a bare table. Always place a fabric underneath it. And of course, don't drop it, whatever you do. Despite all the extra work involved in transporting the scrolls, in retrospect, I wouldn't change a thing. Because bringing Torah out into the world was, in and of itself, a teaching. Yes, Torah scrolls generally live in an aron, in an ark. But Torah cannot only live there. It must live out there, in the world, in our backyards, in our homes, in our hearts. 3 millennia of Jewish thought have left us a legacy not only of Jewish ritual and prayer, but of values. Principles rooted in Torah, cultivated in Jewish communities. As you know, or I hope you know, we formed a values committee to identify our core values and discuss how to integrate them into our community. Each of the sermons I've been giving over the course of these high holidays is connected in some way to the theme of Jewish values. Those values, you should know, guided the decision we made about our B'nai Mitzvah. Other solutions we considered: families alone in their homes with clergy on Zoom, removing the Torah reading, gathering in the sanctuary. All of those were considered and rejected. These decisions were based on competing needs. Public Torah reading reaches at least as far back to the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We knew we wanted to maintain that element of our Shabbat morning service and our B'nai Mitzvah, since having our students read from the physical scroll was a skill and experience we didn't want to sacrifice. We wanted to ensure that everyone who desired to participate in the service could do so. And it was obviously essential to keep everyone safe from danger. And so it was resolved services would be held outdoors, as I said, people's backyards, with both clergy and the Torah scrolls present. The factors that I enumerated above, the factors that went into making this decision, might seem like no-brainers, obvious, self-evident, but each one represents a particular value, a Jewish value that we considered and confirmed. You will see that we have a poster here. It's a beautiful poster created physically by Lawrence Solomon, designed, I should say, by Lawrence Solomon, but it's the work of many people over many months on the Values Committee to come up with our core values, and you will see. Insisting on reading the Torah is informed by a value that we have in our core values in Hebrew, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. Teaching that skill to children is a value drawn from the words of the V'ahavta prayer. V'shinantam levanecha, teach the next generation. Ensuring everyone could participate is a value drawn from the Talmud. Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh B'zeh. I'll talk more about that on Yom Kippur. All Jews are responsible for each other. And keeping everyone safe drew on still another value, Pikuach Nefesh, also represented here, saving life, a value so important that almost without exception it eclipses all others. We did our best to balance all these needs. And what it meant was that not only did the physical Torah travel across Middlesex and Worcester counties, but our understanding of the Torah's values did as well. Notice I said our understanding. When the board began to talk about creating a Jewish values group, David Lears may remember there was some concern. Would this group tell the rest of the congregation what to do? Would the values group become a quasi-rabbinic body with the power to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to decisions before the congregation? In a word, no. One of the things you realize when you look at decisions through the lens of Jewish values is that the process, the act of considering multiple and at times competing values is at least as important as the outcome. Rather than being commanded what to do by an outside force, in talking about values, we uncover the unspoken motivations inside of us. Deliberating upon Jewish values and texts helps us become a more fully realized version of who we already are. Consider the text that we read this morning, the story that's read every Rosh Hashanah morning. We talked about it before. After Sarah miraculously gives birth to Isaac, she demands that Abraham exile not only Hagar, but Ishmael, the son Hagar bore Abraham. Abraham expels both of them with no notice, sending them off with nothing more than some bread and a little bit of water. You saw it in the text. The meager ration soon exhausted, Hagar wails into the wilderness over her dying son, when suddenly an angel of God appears, revealing a well of water. Ishmael's suffering is relieved. Hagar's wailing is answered. I invited you to think about how this story makes you feel. How does it make you feel? There's not one answer. Maybe we see the pain caused to Hagar and Ishmael as the cost of Jewish home, of Jewish continuity. We don't like it, but that's the price you pay. Maybe we're upset with Abraham. Even if it was justifiable to send mother and child away, surely it was immoral to exile them with such meager rations. Maybe we're disappointed in Hagar, that she didn't fight harder for her child. On the other hand, maybe we feel compassion for her or anger on her behalf. Each of these instincts that I have outlined has roots in Jewish values. Value of Jewish continuity is expressed in the Hebrew phrase kehila kadosha, holy community. On the other hand, you could question the holiness of any community that sends away a mother and a child without proper sustenance. In Hebrew, we call this value gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, as in chesed, kindness, or mercy. Or perhaps it's an issue of tzedek, justice, righteousness. If you're disappointed in Hagar's unwillingness to fight harder to save Ishmael's life, you might be a person that is very concerned with pikuach nefesh, saving life. And if you're angry at Abraham, you might rack that up to ahavat hager, the value of loving the stranger, the immigrant, particularly one who lives in your borders and helps run and sustain your household. You might be thinking, Rabbi, do we really need to call these Jewish values? Isn't taking care of a person in need a basic human value? I would agree. And that too is a Jewish value. We call that value B'Tselem Elohim, also on our chart, also on our poster, words from the opening chapter of Genesis that tell us that in creating humans, God said, let's make humans in our own image. Meaning that all human beings are created in the image of God. The text doesn't report God saying, let's make Jews, or Muslims, or Hindus, or Presbyterians for that matter, not men, or straight people, or Republicans, or even democratic socialists. Every single human being is divine. Every one of us. Paradoxically then, the universal idea of dignity living at the core of every soul, that, quote, basic idea of human value, is at root a Jewish idea. The inherent worth of human beings is a bedrock principle for all streams and denominations of Judaism. It cannot be revoked or rescinded. And if that seems obvious, take a look around and see whether this valuing of all life is an obviously universal value to everybody who shares this earth with us. If our value comes from our status as reflections of divinity, so does our ability to make values-based decisions. Because our model for values-based decision-making is none other than God. In contrast to the omniscient God of our cultural imaginings, throughout Jewish text, God is regularly presented as a decider who is frustratingly indecisive. According to a midrash, God was even a little ambivalent about the very idea of creating human beings. As we said, God's words are, let's make humans. It may have occurred to you while I was talking, if there's only one God, then what's with this let us business? Who's God talking to when God says, let's make humans? The midrash says God's talking to the angels. Let's make humans, it turns out, is less a pronouncement from upon high and more of a sitting around the writer's room brainstorming proposition like, hey, I know. What if we made humans? Whoa, that would be amazing. But according to the midrash, immediately the angels around the table split into factions. In Hebrew, Ketim v'chavarot. Different groups. And also immediately these different groups start arguing. Maybe they're Jewish angels. Some like the idea of making humans, and some decidedly do not like this idea. Fascinatingly, the names of the arguing angels correspond to values that we hold dear. In this midrash, in one argument, an angel named Chesed says, let the humans be created. They will do acts of gemilut chasadim. They'll do loving kindness. But an angel named Emes, truth, protests, are you kidding? Don't let the humans be created. They're going to be all lies. In another argument, Tzedek, justice, insists, let the humans be created. They'll do acts of justice. And Shalom, peace, just as assuredly counters, don't let the humans be created. They're all war and conflict and strife. At the height of the argument, the Midrash reports God, quote, casting truth down to the earth. Does this mean that God physically threw truth down, whatever that might mean? Or sent truth out of the heavenly court? Banished from the writer's room? It's completely not clear. The angels, shocked, agree with God to bring truth back, or argue with God, rather, to bring truth back, but then seemingly return to arguing with each other. But God has a surprise for them, because you see, in the words of Rav Huna, the elder of Sepphoris, as the ministering angels were arguing and fighting with each other, the Holy Blessed One said to them, "Why are you arguing? The human has already been created." And there it is. The world, it would seem, is stuck with us. Do we then conclude that God prizes chesed over truth? The Chesed Committee might be happy to hear that. I wouldn't interpret it as a hard and fast rule. What I think the Midrash is teaching us is that in that moment, when a decision had to be made, God made a hard choice, prioritizing mercy over truth and justice over peace. This might really surprise us. Emet, truth, shalom, peace. These are essential Jewish values. We're taught, for instance, God commands us to be rodfei shalom, pursuers of peace. How could God not choose peace? In this instance, peace didn't win out. That's what decisions are about. That's what it means to be a deciding being, created in the image of a deciding God. Very few decisions are simple. More often, we weigh what matters, and we do our best. But we don't know what matters most unless we think about it, and meditate on it, and talk with each other about it, and yes, pray about it. Our model here, as much as it may surprise us, is also God. Another story in the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, Blessings. The rabbis take note of a phrase in the book of Isaiah in which God calls the temple in Jerusalem Beit Tefilati. Bayit or Beit, you might know, means house. Tefillah means prayer. Tefilati means my prayer. Thus, Beit Tefilati would mean God is calling it house of my prayer. Rabbis ask, because this is the kind of thing they ask about. Is this literal? My prayer? God prays? Really? If so, the Talmud asks, no. So what does God pray? Rav Zutra Bar Tovia said that Rav had an answer. I'm not exactly sure how Rav knew the answer. It doesn't say. But in any event, it was taught that God says, this is God's prayer, may it be my will that my compassion conquer my anger. And furthermore, may my compassion prevail over all my other attributes. In that moment, praying, compassion be at the top. Did it work? Did God answer God's prayer? Does God's compassion prevail over God's other attributes? In the words of the Talmudic oracular device, the holy magic 8-ball, reply hazy, ask again later. You might say God struggles with this prayer to this day. But if the sources are telling us anything, it's that our tradition sees God as a model for reflecting one's own values, weighing those values, making decisions based on those values. The decision, for instance, to make human beings in the first place. Rosh Hashanah is, of course, as we say, the birthday of the world, Hayom Harat Olam. But according to our tradition, it is not the first day of creation. It is not the let there be light day, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the 6th day, the let's make humans day. Happy birthday to humanity, it's today. Or in other words, the day that choice was created. It wasn't born in a synagogue. It was born in the soul of every human being, each of us given the godly power of making decisions based on ethics and values that we consider and discuss. But a year and a half of living with COVID, and for some of us tragically dying with COVID, has been a brutal reminder that the way we've lived hasn't always matched our values. The death of 2/3 of a million Americans has raised for some of us existential questioning. People are quitting jobs, changing careers, getting married, changing who they're with. About 20% more houses were sold in November 2020 compared to November 19, according to the US Census. More than half of respondents to a Match.com survey said that they're prioritizing dating and rethinking the qualities that they look for in a partner. Pew Research reports that 80% of US adults thought there was some sort of lesson humanity should be learning from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's common to hear of people making changes in their lives after a near-death experience. But what happens when the whole planet is having a near-death experience? Has there ever been a better moment in our lifetimes to look at our timeless Jewish values? Not because they offer a panacea, an easy life, free of trouble, but because they promise a life of meaning and integrity. What we learn in learning Torah fails if it only lives here, if it's only a nice ritual we do and then forget about when we leave. And Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, as we call the Torah. It says it right on our Torah books, our Chumashim, a living tree, a tradition that promises to change the world that is into the world that could be. It has to come alive outside of a synagogue. It must live in boardrooms and classrooms and break rooms, in wallets and portfolios, party platforms and social media platforms and subway platforms, workshops and print shops and coffee shops. Like it did for our B'nai Mitzvah families in our backyards. It is so easy to slip into a life thoughtlessly molded by somebody else's values, or worse, nobody's values. The logic of the marketplace, the pull of productivity, or some other faceless force that we submit to. We're slotted into business models or demographic profiles, algorithms. To corporations, we're consumers. To politicians, we're voters. To social media platforms, end users. Advances in this kind of profiling have become so sophisticated, we don't even realize it. We've been rightly afraid of tyranny, the tyranny that shows up on balconies and screens shouting absurdly terrifying nonsense. That is really scary. But what about the smooth and subtle tyranny, an invisible network of data points and calculations that invite us to recede into passivity, happy to choose our choices for us? Is that what we're here for? To be fit into models we don't understand, plotted on charts we never see? If we believe in any kind of consciousness within the network of the universe, no matter what we call it, God or something else, that can't be right. A tradition like Judaism that teaches that we are created in God's image, that we are divine, envisions us as choosing beings, reflections of the divine that weigh what's important, consider what choices will manifest light, engender joy, cultivate fairness, propagate peace, and having done so, act accordingly. For millennia, Jews have made these choices in consultation and conversation with Torah. Here in the past year and a half, the Torah came to our backyards, and it was beautiful. Can we welcome it to kick off its shoes and stay a while, to live in our actions, prominently in our choices? We stand, we said before, whenever Torah is lifted, any place, not just in a synagogue. Can we stand up for it and carry it as a part of our lives? On this birthday of the world, this birthday of humanity, this birthday of choice, we are reminded to ask ourselves, what do we believe? We tell our B'nai Mitzvah kids, this Jewish tradition is so important, we are willing to schlep a handwritten scroll all over God's green earth to read it. But after we read it, what then? After the Torah and the Haftarah and the Devar Torah and the candy throwing and the Siman Tov, Mazel Tov, Siman Tov, Mazel Tov, and the thank you cards are written, and Gavolt, the thank you cards are mailed, what happens next? We know that our community can read Torah. It's beautiful. But after the ark is closed and we ride off into the rest of our lives, how do we live it? Why is it important? These beliefs and traditions. So important that some of us have literally given our lives for it. And ultimately, if these teachings are so important that they're worth dying for, aren't they worth living for? Not just in here, but out there. And then, again, every place we go, every place we call here, all the places of our lives. This year, may we consider these timeless and urgent questions. Having done so, may our lives serve as answers. Kin Yehi Ratzon, it should be God's will, it should be our will. I'm going to invite you to take a couple minutes. You've got the poster here. We shouldn't crowd around it too much because of the COVID thing. But come take a look at it. Take 5 minutes. Maybe talk to the person next to you. What are the values? If you're on Zoom, you can start a chat with somebody. What are the values, the Jewish values, who you are that's most important? I may invite you to just take some time now. Come look, come talk, have the conversation. We'll check back in a couple minutes.